The first and last frost dates are one of the key defining characteristics of different regions that need to be taken into consideration by those of us who are growing vegetables. Lots of different types of vegetables are fine with freezing temperatures, and it's amazing how frost tolerant some plants can be. But the popular summer fruiting crops, such as tomatoes and cucumbers, are very different, and many of them can be killed off or severely affected by even a light frost. And here in Ireland, it's the frost-tender potato plant that many of us grow a lot of that is a crop that is most likely to be impacted by frosts, especially in the spring. As a grower, I'm still trying to figure out the best ways to work around the possibility of frost damage, and I've been quite successful for the most part, but I was disappointed by the impact of a frost that we had earlier this month. The Red Gardens are located in the Midlands of Ireland, about as far away as you can get from the oceans and seas that surround this island. While the warming effect of the Gulf Streams provides us with quite a good climate to grow in, despite being so far north, it does have less of an impact this far inland, leading to slightly greater range of temperatures, including more frosts. The typical last expected frost date in the spring for this area would be around the middle of April, with the first frost of the autumn generally expected around the last week of October. This theoretically gives us around 185 to 200 days of frost-free growth in the summer. But my personal experience is that these frost dates can vary a lot, and we have experienced frost as late as the end of May and as early as in late September, and I need to work around this possibility. Traditional gardening lore around here has lots of growers planting early potatoes on St. Patrick's Day, which would mean that the plants could be really well established to be badly affected by these late frosts. But I suspect that this gardening advice is better suited for growers who are located closer to the coasts, where they don't get frost this late in the season. Over the years, I've learned to not plant courgette or zucchini and pumpkins or squash until late May, even though this reduces the yield and the plants miss out on the warmth and good growing conditions that we often get in the spring. There are also issues with tomato plants, as well as the related aubergine or eggplants, as well as peppers, because of the long time that it takes them to produce a crop, and I try to get them planted into the polytunnel as early as possible. These plants are usually quite safe from frost under the protection of the plastic, or that's what I thought. The frosts that we usually get in late spring are typically quite light and generally develop on clear nights with no cloud cover, very little wind, and often following a sunny day. On these nights, the temperature of the air gradually falls over the nighttime and reaches the freezing point just before dawn. This short amount of time can be just enough to cause the water in some leaves to freeze, which bursts the cell wall, killing off sections of the leaves that have been affected. I've become quite used to these lighter frosts, but earlier this month I saw a forecast for the 4th or 5th of May that indicated that temperatures could drop several degrees below the freezing point overnight due to an unusually cold air mass over most of Europe. That night, the temperatures dropped below freezing just after midnight and stayed below freezing for 5 or 6 hours before warming up again just after dawn. This longer period of time and colder temperatures would allow more heat to dissipate and the possibility of greater frost damage to set in. It seems like a very subtle difference of a few degrees, but it could be the difference between success and failure for some crops, and it reduces the effectiveness of some of the protections that I usually put in place. Whenever a frost is forecast, I always look around my gardens and try to protect whatever plants might be growing that could be at risk. I knew that all the seedlings and young plants in the heated propagation space would be fine, but the early potato plants in the polytunnel garden were really well established, and a deep enough frost could kill off a lot of the leaves and destroy the chance of an early yield from these plants. So I decided to cover the long rows of these large plants with a length of horticultural fleece, which is a fabric that has quite a good insulating value, but still lets a lot of the light in. I'm really glad that I had invested in a full roll of this horticultural fleece a few years ago, so that I had it on hand when I needed it. I knew that all of the other crops in this polytunnel garden would be fine with this level of frost, as I hadn't transplanted in any tomato plants or the other tender crops yet. Most of the plants in the outside gardens were quite hardy, except for the early crop of potatoes, which had only just started to appear in 4 of the outside gardens. I knew that these plants were small enough to be able to recover from any frost damage, but it could delay the crop and reduce the yield a bit, so I thought that it was better to protect them if I could. I ended up covering 2 of the batches with fleece and the other 2 with a different kind of crop cover. I was also concerned about the tomato plants that I had recently transplanted into the larger polytunnel that I have. So I decided to set up a full tank of water and filled a number of buckets with water and set them around the space of the polytunnel as a precaution. I was hoping that the thermal mass of this large volume of water would be enough to keep the temperatures above freezing in this space, but I wasn't sure if it was enough. It's always a judgment call in this type of situation to figure out how much effort to put in to avoid a potential risk, and in this case I didn't do enough. After the strong frost that one night, I was glad to see that the potatoes in the polytunnel were not affected at all, as the double layer of the plastic on the polytunnel and the fleece over the plants worked really well in combination. The potatoes in the outside gardens that I had covered with a double layer of fleece were all fine, apart from a bit of damage to some of the leaves on a few of the plants at the end of the row, where obviously a bit of cold air had gotten in. I suspect that it helped that the young plants were at the base of a shallow trench, which left an airspace between the leaves and the fleece above. All of these plants are fine and a few weeks later are growing really strongly, and they seem to have benefited from the extra warmth of the fleece that was covering them for those few days. The other type of crop cover was less effective, and a fair number of the potato leaves in two of my other gardens were burnt. These plants will recover, and a few weeks later they're all growing strongly again, but it's hard to know what the impact on the yield will be, though I suspect it'll be fairly light. It was interesting to observe that a few of the plants that had been covered with a double layer of this crop cover material were not affected at all, and now seem to be a little bit more advanced than the other plants right beside them. While it was good news for the potato crop, unfortunately the tomato plants in my larger polytunnel were hit fairly hard by the frost. I think that things could have been a lot better if I'd filled up the tanks and buckets with water a lot earlier in the day, so the water would have had a chance to warm up a lot more. And this was my first mistake. The tomato plants in the middle of the space, away from the doors at either end, were untouched. Closer to the end doors, the plants started to get a bit of frost-burnt patches on the edges of the leaves, which will slow the plants down a bit, but they should recover reasonably well. The tomato plants closest to the end doors were badly hit, with most of the leaves on the plants getting frost damage. It seems that a draft through the gap at the base of the door was an issue, and I just didn't think of that. Normally on these frosty nights we don't have any wind, but apparently there was enough to cause the damage, and that was my second mistake. At one end of the polytunnel, the damage was a bit less, and I suspect that this was due to the larger volume of water in the large tank. A few weeks later, these plants are showing signs of decent regrowth, so I should still get a reasonable crop of tomatoes out of them. The plants at the other end were in really bad shape, and I decided to replace some of them with surplus tomato plants that I was growing for a slightly later crop for the other polytunnel garden. I will still get a lot of tomatoes out of this polytunnel, but I'm more disappointed that it disrupts the variety trial that I was undertaking, where I've been growing 32 different varieties of tomatoes. I still have most of the varieties of tomatoes growing, but because some of them were badly affected by the frost and others weren't, I won't be able to do the yield comparison that I was planning to do. But at least I'll be able to taste most of the varieties. As with so many experiences in the gardens, there is a bit of learning in all of this, or reinforcing what I already knew. There is definitely a risk of transplanting tomato plants into a polytunnel too early. And the early crop of potatoes are also at risk, but these can be protected by horticultural fleece, and a double layer is definitely better than a single layer. Thermal mass works up to a point, but only if it has a chance to warm up a lot. And keeping out the drafts is a big learning point for me, and the one thing that I'll definitely be adding to my list of things to check whenever there's a risk of frost. In the future, I think I'll make an effort to cover the tomato plants, probably by attaching fleece to the support strings on either side of the row of plants, as I think this could really help. Having an active source of heat in these polytunnels on these cold nights could be of real benefit, as all it has to do is raise the temperature by a few degrees, and this is something I'm going to look into in the future. But of course, all of these things take more work, preparation, and material, and it would be a lot easier to simply delay the plantings until the risk of frost is over. But I'm willing to do a certain amount of work to get an earlier crop from my gardens, or at least to reduce the risk of frost damage. I'm really interested in exploring a few ways of boosting the temperature in this polytunnel overnight, and there seems to be a number of different options for doing this, from the simple and passive to the complex and mechanized. But I think it would be beneficial to explore a few of these, as raising the nighttime temperature by even a few degrees not only reduces the risk of frost, but it seems to be able to boost the growth rate of plants in the spring and even extend the harvesting into the autumn. I'm definitely interested in experimenting with a lot of this, and I'll be sure to make more videos about it all in the future. And this is where support from people like you comes in handy. The usual liking and sharing of this video and subscribing to my channel definitely helps. And for those of you who are interested in supporting this Red Gardens project even more, I've identified a few options in the description below, and any contributions will definitely help to fund future explorations and experiments. But watching my videos is by far the best support that you can give, and thank you for making it all the way to the end of this one.